How do you analyze whether an invention is obvious? Well, there is a test, and you could think of it as two different steps. So there are first so-called primary considerations that could help establish that an invention is obvious. But even if that's the case, you are still supposed to consider secondary considerations. And only then do you make a conclusion overall that the invention is obvious. That may sound very straightforward, but we haven't yet talked about how each of these steps has multiple things to consider. So let's start with primary considerations. Here are the three different primary considerations. Now, oftentimes, people will just jump to trying to figure out the difference between the claimed invention and the prior art without the first two prerequisites, which are essential to put things in context. So, for example, if the claimed invention is some kind of food item, like a puff pastry, I don't think a mechanical engineer or an astrophysicist would be your relevant person of skill in the art. So the person of skill in the art is the one who is closest to making the actual claimed invention at issue. So for a drug, it would probably be someone with a life sciences background, biology, chemistry, etc. But if you're talking about a car or a rocket, somebody with a background in physics or some kind of engineering. So it really all depends on the invention. And some basic inventions may not even require an advanced degree. Now, the second issue is the scope and content of the prior art. And for obviousness, you are only considering prior art that is, quote, analogous, i.e., it's the exact field of invention, or it's a different field, but it's the same basic problem you're trying to solve. And then lastly, the differences between the claimed invention and prior art can be a little bit tricky because unlike analyzing whether an invention is new based on a single prior art reference, for obviousness, you can consider multiple prior art sources and combine elements from different sources if someone of skill in the art would have thought to do so. Now, how do you know? It's a little bit of a guessing game, and it can be hard not to have some kind of hindsight bias. And that's part of why we also have secondary considerations. But it is important to first remember, at least, that you can combine multiple references. Now, even if you combine multiple references, you might not get all the elements of the claimed invention. You might still have 10% that is not in any piece of prior art. But the invention might be obvious if to someone of skill in the art, they would know to add in, i.e. slightly change what already exists to create the claimed invention. So that could be their own intuition, common sense, or just basically what the market demands. So any of those things could be what makes up the difference to make it obvious. But even if, based on these things, it seems obvious, there's still a second step, which is, are there secondary considerations, which are generally objective factors that might establish the invention as actually not obvious? But these only count if there is a nexus to the claimed invention. And nexus is a fancy word for a connection. So, for example, the very first one I'll talk about, although these are in a random order, is if you have unexpected results. So what would be an unexpected result as a result of, i.e., a nexus to the claimed invention? Well, I'll give you an example. So the drug that we know of as Viagra was first tested for something quite different than male impotence. And when they found the drug did not work for that intended purpose, the scientists were a little puzzled why their subjects, the men, refused to stop taking it. Only after further questioning did they find out that there was the unexpected benefit of curing impotence. So that is an unexpected result. Um, so another possible secondary consideration is a long felt and unsolved need. So for example, for years, scientists have been trying to come up with a vaccine for HIV. So we know that it's needed, but it has never been solved. So if someone could figure it out tomorrow, that would not be obvious, even though it's obvious to try to figure out. We all know that it's needed. Another possibility is that the invention is contrary to prior teaching or that there's initial skepticism. These are kind of related. So some examples involve the iPad. There were all these articles before the iPad came out saying this is such a stupid idea, no one will ever buy it. And yet after Apple launched it, other companies saw that this was a actual desire that consumers had for this new device. So other companies started making them. Similarly, the iPhone, initially, people were skeptics. They were saying, well, everyone's used to buttons. This is not going to take off. And yet today, phones are almost all with a touch screen. So it's contrary to teaching, people were skeptics, and yet it succeeded. Somewhat related sometimes is commercial success, but this can be tricky. So do people buy Apple products because it's Apple or because there's something really innovative? Now, with the two examples I showed you, I don't think it was just because it was an Apple product. I think it was because these were really different than what existed before. It was non-obvious. So commercial success, I think, is most easily demonstrated if you have a small business or even independent inventor and the invention is wildly successful on the market with little to no advertising. In contrast, if you have a lot of sales because you underprice the invention or you have lots of marketing, then that's not because of the invention. It's because of other things. So when I say because of the invention, I'm like, well, is it so cool that these things happen? Sometimes related to commercial success is copying, licensing, or industry recognition. So one thing that I think is a good example is the Precor elliptical machine. So Precor was the first company to make an elliptical, and after that, all these other companies started making these machines because they realized that these are things that people like. Before, they were either bikes or there were stair steppers, but this kind of combines both and gives you a whole different experience. So these are all possible things that could show an invention is obvious. And hopefully that was a helpful overview for how to analyze obviousness.